All right, welcome to the Office Player podcast. My name is James, and the purpose of this podcast is to highlight workplace related challenges or situations which we find ourselves in. And I have a lot of interviews with real professionals who can shed some light on the situation. So we want to help you all out there to be more effective in the workplace. My name is James, and I'm a recovering corporate executive with more than 22 years of experience in sales, marketing, and leadership roles. And today, I help young professionals and their managers navigate the challenges in the modern workplace through coaching, training, and consulting. Connect with me, James Ching, on LinkedIn to find out more. Today, I'm very, very super excited that for inaugural episode one of the Office Slayer podcast, I have online my guest, my ex-colleague Nadia, and I'll let Nadia introduce herself.
Thank you, James. Well, look, firstly, thank you so much for the invite in coming and joining you for your first episode of the Office Slayer podcast. I'm so excited to, I think, just see what you do moving forward and all the different guests that you bring in. And I'm sure we've got lots more to talk about too, but today's going to be pretty exciting. Look, in terms of my background, I've worked in 20 odd years or 20 or more years in professional services, and similar to yourself, I've worked into global HR solutions firms. In that time, I was a people leader for about 10 years, and in the last 5 years, I worked in a learning and org development capacity as a talent and learning partner for 3 brands across a group. I think an important thing to share with, the people listening or watching is that I was also born and raised in Australia to migrant parents of Polish, Russian, and Greek descent. So, given the topic that we're going to talk about today and navigating those cross-cultural minefields in the workplace and really talking about these diverse cultures that we work across, particularly in global organisations, I thought it would be important to share that, particularly in the richness that it brings to corporate culture. Well, you and I have worked together now for, probably the last 4 years or so. We worked together in a previous organisation. I know, James, you facilitated a few sales segments for us in an onboarding program that, we hosted with our new starters. But also, as recent of end of 2023, we also worked on a global sales project together. So that was fun. And look, what I'm up to now. So I, funnily enough, am currently enjoying what I'm calling fun employment, which is really exciting for me. So look, my role was made redundant in late February this year. And so for the first time in my 20 plus year career, I've just for the last 2 months enjoyed some time off, spending time with the kids. It's been a real blessing to be able to have more quality time with the family. And really, I'm actually have been busy too, setting up a new business venture as well as a career coach and a learning and development consultant too. So there's more to come on that. I'm definitely sort of taking my time and being quite specific around what that will look like. But again, watch this space and again, you can follow me on LinkedIn to find out more in the future.
Great. Thanks, Nadia, for sharing your background. And I'm so sorry that I made you do all the legwork to introduce yourself. But in short, guys out there, Nadia is a very great colleague of mine for the last 3+ years. Every time I have an L&D topic where, it is not just for the purpose of the Australian market, but it's also for the purpose of Asia Pacific, I reach out to Nadia, and she's always ready to give me advice and how we should do this because she's done tons of training, to everyone, right, in the organization. So I think we're in the right room. Today we wanted to actually talk about navigating cross-cultural minefields in the workplace. And I'm sitting in Singapore, and Nadia is sitting in Australia. I'll let you guess which city she's in. But maybe I could just start off by asking Nadia. So, Nadia, why is learning about cross-cultural minefields important for you?
Yeah, thanks, James. Just quickly about the regions. I mean, you can guess I'm in Melbourne, but look at what we're wearing in terms of where we're sitting across the world and the differences in weather as well. So it also has a lot to do, I think, with these cross-cultural relationships that we have, because we're always in
Yes.
different seasons across the world, particularly across APAC as well. So, look, learning about cross-cultural minefields is really important. I think diversity, equity, and inclusion continue to be a huge part of what we're focusing on each day at work. And I think cultural sensitivity training is definitely something that a lot of leaders and organisations need to really highlight. It needs to be a core investment, I think, in organisations that definitely do have a global footprint, and particularly with teams that are working across regions, really focusing on how they engage and how they collaborate with each other is so important. And being able just to raise awareness on some of these unconscious or the unconscious bias that actually does come to play or that exists in these companies, particularly within these multicultural environments, is really, hugely important. And like yourself, when we've worked in these global firms, we can see that navigating through some of these minefields daily is what we do. You and I have had previous conversations, obviously leading up to this first podcast. Communication, right, is so important, particularly where English is the universal language. But hey, it still has its challenges, and we'll delve in a little bit deeper soon enough. But the other thing that we've covered off is the power distance. And so, do we actually see everyone as equals when we're working across these different cultures and these different regions? How do we navigate those environments where there's a real distinction in power and hierarchy? And one thing I think that you've really highlighted that you've got, more to share on is the geopolitics and what's that geopolitical landscape that we talk about in these or these rich cultural teams. How do we actually get our team members with these strong political views to actually get along in the workplace? And I'm sure we'll dive deeper into that too. But I think that's so important, particularly around just raising awareness and really starting to think about how important that cultural sensitivity training is in the workplace.
Great. Thanks, Nadia. Of course, for our audience in the workplace, especially in a global cross-cultural workplace, there are tons of minefields that each one of us has to navigate. And I totally, concur with what Nadia is saying. Most of us kind of sort of navigate through that as we are presented with the situation. And we hopefully, in most situations, exercise our best judgment and apply it right. But actually, a lot of us work in international and multicultural environments for work, and we're just curious why hasn't there been more, I guess, structured, training and awareness and conversations around how can we help professionals, executives get better at this, right? Because if all of us don't have the awareness of it, then everyone is kind of attacking the problem with their own lens, and then suddenly you have 10 million ways of dealing with this very common topics, right? So thanks for highlighting those. I'm glad to be able to go deeper into these topics with you, Nadia, today. Let's start with the first one. Okay, so for lack of a better way of saying it, I call it the "but we all speak English" minefield, right? So to your point earlier, English is a universal language in the workplace for most of us, no matter which country cultures we come from. So, Nadia, do you have an example you'd like to share just to kick us off a little bit?
Well, look, to be honest, James, if we're going to talk about how many variations of the English language there are, I think let's not go there, because we've had a conversation too about sometimes the challenges I think that we face, particularly having English as the universal language. Whether it was a different language, who knows? Would it be easier? But let's wait and see. I think when it comes to communication, particularly with English, we've just got to ensure that the opportunities to collaborate across these different regions and these different cultures as leaders, we make it easier for our people and we make it easier for our colleagues to be able to communicate effectively. If English is the second language for some of our international counterparts, obviously there are going to be, some challenges that come to to call when I think exchanging, communication. But different video conferencing tools. There's instant messaging, and particularly if you're going to work on projects that are across region or cross culture, it's really important to also have the right project management tools in place to really make that communication a little bit more fluid, and a little bit easier, particularly across the different groups. I think for me, having worked in obviously across the Asian team and facilitating some training sessions and also co-hosting some different workshops, and then also recently or towards the last sort of 18 months to 2 years being a little bit more um, available to our global counterparts as well. Navigating accents for me was huge, and I'm not going to lie, it definitely can be challenging. And I'm not saying that I don't have an accent either, because I've got a pretty strong Aussie twang when it comes to, I think, my communication and my pronunciation. So there are times where people actually struggle to also understand me.
Yeah.
My
I
face
actually
is
like
quite
the
expressive.
Yeah, I actually like the Aussie twang. It's kind of like a more informal version to me of British English, and it's
Yes.
for me it's kind of for me when you guys speak in an Aussie accent, it just tells me that it's so in line with the whole Aussie psyche for me. Like you guys are happy-go-lucky as a people, as a society, and working with you guys is kind of like, okay, let's try that. It's always we're always up for something to try, and there's that spirit that is reflected. I don't know. At least that's what it sounds to me. I think for me, for working with Australian colleagues, it's sometimes the different slight variations in lingo that you have across states. Uh, for
Absolutely.
example, I remember this conversation months ago. I was in maybe Sydney or Melbourne for work, and then some of the colleagues were from Brisbane, and then we were having a bit of a laugh, trying to understand why do uh, folks from Brisbane try to shorten everything. So like for example, Brisbane is Brissy, and and yeah,
Or put
yeah.
O at the end of everything, or they just abbreviate everything. And we have pet names or nicknames for everyone. And I think sometimes too, where the working culture can probably be a little bit more laid back. I mean, that there are firms that are very ultra professional, and there is still, I think, a professional landscape that you have to abide by. But there's probably a little bit more risk taking potentially. There is less of that sort of hierarchical power distance that we're going to talk about in a
Mm,
moment, which then I think allows people to be quite open in communicating. But I think sometimes what I noticed too when we were on these international or these regional calls, where the Aussies would really just not overtake the call, but
mm,
would sort of say that, "Oh, sorry for I'd always hear sorry that, but I'm hijacking the meeting," because we do tend to speak a lot more, because we sit more comfortably with English, and so then we can sometimes sort of overtake the workshops. I think you've got to be mindful of that too, particularly when you are dealing with, I think, other cultures and other nationalities who potentially may not be as confident to speak in an open forum, but then have ways in which they can also communicate. But it's interesting because I hear, "I'm sorry for hijacking the meeting" from so many of my Aussie colleagues all the time.
yeah, okay. Thanks, Nadia, for sharing that. I think you're onto something. I seem to recall a couple of calls, regional sales calls, where we are trying to launch something or announce something, and then typically, well, tell me if I'm getting this right, based on your experience as well. Typically, it would be the Aussies are on, and then there are camera switch on and ready to go, and then maybe starting to talk about a bit with the other colleagues about the weather, vacation or the weekend, or their families, pets, things like that. And then we have a lot of the colleagues from Southeast Asia is kind of a mixed bag. I think Singapore is in the middle. Singapore colleagues would love to turn the camera on. Usually that's not a problem. But maybe they are just a little bit more shy in terms of like initiating small talk. Just to kind of ease into the conversation. I think Singapore work culture has this. I wouldn't say it's the best habit. It's more of like cutting to the chase and let's get the work done and all that. But I think over the years, and I've observed that as well. For Singapore, a lot of colleagues know and understand the value of engaging with their colleagues from a different culture outside of
Yeah.
the purpose of the meeting, right? So I think it's a way that other cultures get to know each other better on personal level, and that's super
That's,
important when we
yeah.
need to collaborate across cultures. And then we have the rest of the Southeast Asians, and it's really a mixed bag because I think some you would have to join the call, and then it's like, oh, but they're not turning the cameras on. You know, so you don't know who you're talking to, and then you don't know if they're there, and then they're usually on mute, right? So, and for most of these colleagues, it's exactly like what you said. Their English is not their first language, and I think there's something else at work though, which is maybe related to the power distance part. We can talk about later,
Yeah.
which is the fact that usually for meetings they have a habit, or it is in their nature, in their culture, to kind of defer to the people whom they consider more senior, whether functionally or in terms of hierarchy and all that, right? So and more likely than not, they are more hesitating about asking questions, right? And I think when we want to work collaboratively across cultures, that can pose an issue for those of us who need to drive certain initiatives across the organization, right? Yeah.
Can I mean, on that communication piece too around the rapport building, at the beginning of the call or beginning of the workshop, it's so important. And it definitely depends, right, on the size of the call, the size of the audience as well that, is on the call. If it's a global call and you've got certain, senior executives on the call, then obviously you've got to be a bit more mindful about what rapport is being built and maybe a little bit more mindful. But if it's a smaller team, and again, you've got this opportunity where you are introducing some people, and it's a team that are going to be working together for a period of time, and you want that rapport to be built because the way that communication can also improve across regions and across cultures, help them build a relationship, help them build some rapport, help them to connect, help them to get to know each other. So it's really important, I think, that we nurture that sometimes at the beginning of these virtual calls that we nowadays live on 24/7. We're not meeting in person as often. So I think that communication factor, particularly around building rapport at the beginning of these virtual sessions, particularly across regions, it's huge and it's so important.
Yeah, so thanks, Nadia, for highlighting those. I think maybe for this challenge, this particular minefield of, but we all speak English, what advice would you have for cross-cultural colleagues who need to work in that environment in order to minimize misunderstandings and, make sure that we are able to work more effectively?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds so simple, right? But I think sometimes it's the simple things that we forget to do when we're so bogged down in potentially meeting after meeting after meeting or workshop after workshop, and you're bouncing between different calls and different audiences, and potentially you just get, straight to the point. So let's sort of jump back to maybe spend some time at the beginning, even if it's just 5 or 10 minutes, just to build a little bit of rapport, create a certain energy, right, that is going to make people feel that little bit more comfortable so that they have the confidence to maybe openly communicate a little bit more with confidence, right? So to spend the time doing that at the beginning of your calls, slowing down even just the pace of your communication. I'm naturally a very fast mover, fast, talker. So it's always been, particularly when I started to shift into facilitation and training, so important that I was definitely taking the right breaths, slowing down the pace of my communication, but also to, given the different cross cultures, it's enunciating your words really clearly too. So whether English is your first language or your second language, just making sure that you do enunciate. And it's easier said than done, but not being shy, not holding back, but really trying to, where you can, build the confidence, be more share more and just work with building that connection, with each other. And if all else fails, I guess there's always email, or there's always instant messaging where you can then put some concerns, opinions, or feedback in writing, and then continue to communicate in writing so that you're not missing any points. Or if there is a bit of misunderstanding from a verbal communication perspective, then you've got the opportunity then for the written communication.
Yeah,
But
I think those are
probably,
great tips, Nadia. So I think for me, I would probably add to your list and say that just be maybe mindful and conscious and aware of the different communication preferences of the different cultures that we work with. So, for example, if we were to use the example I cited just now, where let's say is the Singapore team and the Australia team probably will be fine on the call. Everyone's camera is on, and then yes, we start a little bit of the warm up at the beginning, and then we just launch into it. And most of the time, we will understand each other 100%, right? And then we usually end the call with kind of like a recap of what went on, and then maybe follow up with an email, right? That's usually sufficient. But I think for some of the other cultures in Southeast Asia, and let's say it's Singapore with them or Australia with them, then we just need to be mindful that maybe the very first call that you do with them, they're just going to leave their cameras off, right? And that's just going to annoy the hell out of you. And you just need to be a bit more okay with it, and
yeah,
maybe use get use a few sessions to get to know their communication patterns. Maybe for the first couple of sessions, you are just talking to a room full of pictureless screens, right? And then which are all muted. And I think what I've tried in the past that helps is actually to when there's a point in a normal point in the session where you need to ask questions, maybe it's okay to respectfully ask one colleague or a second colleague to give their opinion. And this is when they usually unmute and the camera comes on, and then try and compliment them to say, hey, you look nice today, or whatever, something that is not creepy and makes them comfortable, and encourage them to leave their camera on, right? So I think maybe
yeah,
try this for a few times, and then people also get used to you having the expectation that, hey, we all work with cameras on over here, right? And then I remember there was one leader that I worked with where he would patiently wait for every single blank screen to be switched on with the camera before he continues the meeting. That was so awkward. That was really awkward. I think we waited for like a good
mm,
2 minutes. I think people, maybe some of them were like kind of scrambling to, I don't know, put on makeup, put on the clothes that they need to
put on
put
their
on.
lippy. Yep.
Just so that, okay, so and so is really waiting for the cameras to be on, before he continues. And because he's the leader, so I think folks realize that they didn't really have a choice. It's like, okay, we have to kind of conform to what was the corporate culture prevalent at the time, which was everyone on the sales team
Yeah,
needs to come to a meeting with the camera on, right? So I think that's one other thing. The third is, of course, if you are a sales leader, or you're a leader of a team that is sitting in different parts of Asia, I think it's actually not a bad idea to just set up the ground rules so that people know what to expect, right? So that there are no
yeah,
misunderstandings. You're not seen as being pushy, but like they don't come away thinking that, oh, but James, you didn't say that you need cameras to be on, blah blah blah, and all that, right? So just have that upfront, and so that there are no surprises, and then so it becomes the norm, right? So if people cannot turn their camera on, they will text you and they'll tell you, oh, why they can't do it today, right? Yeah.
yeah. But just by you sharing this, like it really makes me think there's a whole other session on virtual meeting
Yes.
etiquette, right? Because again, every manager has a different expectation of what's expected and what's not. But I think we found through COVID, because this is when the virtual meeting world really exploded. there are a lot of conversations that we were having with leaders around where you can, try and get the individuals to pop their cameras on so you can just check in, right, and just make sure that they're okay. Because by hearing them and not necessarily seeing their body language, seeing sort of those non-verbal cues, you're not going to fully really understand whether someone's okay from a mental health perspective. So there's some real benefits, I think, to also making sure that we do have our cameras on and that we are sharing, because you can connect better. Absolutely, you're building a stronger relationship, but you're also able to check in and make sure that people are okay. But yeah, look, we could talk about virtual meeting etiquette. That could be a whole other topic, I think, because
Yeah.
it's so important. Yeah,
Yeah, no, and I think the last point I just want to say before we close off this topic and move on to the next one is that I think you're absolutely right, Nadia. For the cultures where English is not the first language, most of the time, at least from based on my experience, they are actually super good at written English, and versus spoken, right? So they're more confident writing in English than speaking. So let's say you've just had a meeting where many of them didn't ask questions, but maybe because that you have worked with them before, that actually some of them have very strong opinions about this. So I think one tip here could be to actually reach out to those colleagues separately after the call and kind of just, hey, so and so, I noticed that you didn't have any questions and all that about this new project, whatever initiative that we're launching that we discussed in the call. Do you want to just take a 15 minutes, just one to one with me, so we can just walk through some concerns you might have, or maybe you can just drop
yeah.
me an email and all that. And usually, when you try to reach out like this, it does invite them to share a bit more because I think for them, a one-to-one situation or an email is a bit more comfortable for them to do versus like going into this big questions during a big meeting, right? So that's something to look out
And
for.
I agree with you. I think our non-English speaking colleagues have a very beautiful way of writing English. I mean, because of the way that they're, I think, trained. If I think about some of the Singaporean, the Chinese, and Japanese, and even Chinese colleagues that I've worked with in the past, their emails are just put some of our put our local emails to shame, because we can sometimes be a little bit too casual and too colloquial, whereas our non-English speaking counterparts or colleagues can then present their written communication really beautifully and quite polished in an email. So that then adds, I think, or adds to their favour, or works to their favour, definitely. So I think being open to that and then putting it in writing and giving them the option to also engage in writing is really key for
Yeah,
sure.
cool. I think that's a nice segue to go into our second topic, which is our second minefield, which I call the power distance minefield, right? So, for the audience joining us, power distance is this concept that is talked about in Professor Erin Meyer's book called The Culture Map. And she's researched cross-cultural workplace dimensions for many years, and she's got a very, very best-selling book on that. I encourage all of you who need to work cross-culturally to pick up that book and have a read. It's really fascinating what her research has done. So in the culture map, she actually talks about, I think, 7 to 9 different dimensions or cultural dimensions, and then how each culture actually responds quite differently on a scale, which is like from left to right, right? So, and the left and the right of the axis are the opposites of each other, right? So, just to explain this a little bit, power distance in Professor Aaron Meyer's context, it says either low or either it's high. And high power distance, it would be cultures where they usually typically show a deference to someone who is a senior, someone who's their leader, someone who's an expert. Whereas
Yeah.
low power distance would be cultures where the approach tends to be more egalitarian and equal and meritocratic, even in a hierarchical organization, right? So I don't know if I'm correct, Nadia, but I would say probably Australia is tending a little bit more towards the low power distance side of the axis, right?
Mm.
And then I think Singapore is in the middle, and then maybe in Asia Pacific you have China, Japan, and Korea on the right hand side, where they are high power distance countries, and then you have Vietnam and Thailand kind of similar to them as well. Yeah,
Look, totally agree with you. Absolutely. I think when we think about some of the calls that we've been on together, some of the regional training or some of the global town calls that we've experienced, different cultures have different hierarchies, and you really can see it playing out in some of those sessions, where they're, like you're saying, particularly from the culture map, where there are flatter structures, there is absolutely less power distance. Where there's clear hierarchy in more complex structures, there is so much more power distance. And I think too, it could, I mean, it also comes from, I think, the cultural element, a huge cultural element where there's a significant or a distinct, maybe not fear of authority, but respect for authority, right? And so whether that comes from even just the way that you've been raised,
yeah,
through, societal norms over time, and how you've been parented, depending on then how you, or, what level of fear of authority you have, um, or respect for authority more than anything, because there is definitely a very high respect. And I remember when I first joined the business that we worked with about 7 years ago, about 18 months to 2 years in, we had a CEO that came he'd been CFO in our Japanese business, and he had come to Australia to be our chief financial officer. And there were evenings where I, as the state leader, would be in the office at sort of 6:30, 6:45, and I would always stay later to do my work because that could be my focus time, and I'd also miss the traffic, going home then to the family, so I'd get home a lot sooner if I left work at 5:30. And he came up to me once and said, why are there no team members here at, 6:30, 6:45? I said, well, 5:30 is generally when they finish work, and I let them go. They're out of here. He said, but in Japan, if the leader's there till 10:30, the colleagues are there till 10:30 p.m. No one is to leave until the leader has left the office.
yeah.
And I thought, wow, this is not Australia, unfortunately.
That
And
was an aha moment for
as
you. Like it's quite
you can't
different.
expect, right?
Yeah, yeah,
It's so there's definitely right. Is I think there's a huge, I think, cultural piece, particularly around what works and what's acceptable, right? Because we're not saying that it's not acceptable. It's very, very different. But when it comes to, I think, bringing the two cultures or bringing various cultures together, again, that education piece I think is really, really important. But also, it's important that our leaders, our managers, and some of our senior colleagues are more important and more comfortable, I think, in sharing opinions. That's coming from a hierarchy where it's quite complex and there is more power distance. How do we try and still make these younger, maybe Gen Zs or these early in career colleagues, who do typically shy away from sharing in some of these more hierarchical organisations and in more of these complex environments? How do we try and allow them or give them the confidence to share,
yeah.
because particularly in these different cross sections of businesses. But again, so much I think comes to play too in just what's the workplace etiquette, but then also from a societal and a community and a how perspective of how you've been raised and what that respect for authority is, makes a huge difference too, I think, in this piece around power distance, for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Nadia. I think from my experience, I can think of two things that might help us to understand a little bit of what's going on here. One is, I think in Australia you have this term called, is it the tall poppy? Um,
Mhm. Yeah,
which is, if I understood
syndrome.
it correctly, which is like everyone is equal, and you don't want to shine too much, something like that, right? So that kind of, to your point about education, upbringing, that that kind of seeps into the entire psyche of society in Australia, right? So to different extents, people pick up different parts of it as they grow up. So that maybe explains why, in Australia, yes, you respect your leader, but it's not the kind of deference that you see in some of the other Asian cultures. I think on the opposite end, at least from my experience, the high power distance, culture deference and all that, and exactly the example you mentioned about the Japanese leader comes from this shared, I guess, heritage, which China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, some countries in Southeast Asia share, which is something called Confucianism. Right? So Confucianism is about respecting elders. It is about keeping quiet when your leader is talking. Some of it is really bizarre if we apply to a workplace. But I think that's how we were all brought up. Even in schools, when we are in front of a teacher, what the teacher says is basically gospel, and you're supposed to just listen, right? So I think in a lot of Asian societies, that is the dominant culture of that's a dominant way of handling hierarchies. And so when we from these cultures bring this to work, this is how we show up, right? So we show up by, okay, so if the boss is Japanese and he's expecting us to stay until 10, okay, we just have to suck it up and stay until 10. Even though it doesn't make sense, we've all done our work hours ago, right? So I think that's kind of explaining why certain leaders have this kind of expectations and all that. But to your point again, I think the way to maybe navigate around this is to say, if you're a new leader coming from a high power distance culture like Japan, you come into a low power culture, distance culture like Australia, then you need to set some ground rules, right? Then you need to give the Australia team maybe a little bit of psychological safety to say, hey, in my culture, this is how we work. But over here, you guys do what you feel is right for you, and then I think it's super important that that Japanese leader is also then working with his minus ones, his level one down, to kind of ensure that they get the right calibration of what approach is appropriate, right? And maybe you will end up in this phase where the Japanese leader is very, of a very strong opinion, and he's going to say we have to do it the Japanese way, which means that you need to negotiate with him and what works and what doesn't work. I think that's probably how it works. Yeah.
And you know what makes me think about our Generation Zs, right, or our Gen Zs, who they want to be more empowered and they need to feel ownership, right? And they want to make decisions and feel somewhat independent in the workplace. And so this is also a generational piece. It's not a cultural piece. So how do we then start to really combat that, particularly within Asia, right, where we have such a cultural power distance, particularly for our Gen Z. So I think what you're doing in terms of your coaching and sort of helping them understand how to navigate, this corporate culture that exists is so important. And then the concept of intrapreneurialism or entrepreneurship. So we talk about entrepreneurship, but then intrapreneurship is something that recently in Australia was, over the last 2 years, was definitely introduced into our business, where the CEO at the time wanted to see and wanted to hear ideas from the people up. So it wasn't a top-down approach, but it was more of a bottom-up approach. And it was like, what do you want to see change in this business? What new ideas do you want to bring to the fore? We have a working group, right, that is all about entrepreneurship, and we want you to bring your ideas to the table. And we, as your senior leaders, being say the so-called servant leaders, will help make it happen. So,
Yeah.
so how different is it in terms of how do we then work on this power distance piece? How do we help support? And you know what? In Australia, sometimes it can go the other way. It can be too laissez-faire, say, in terms of a working culture, and there needs to be stronger leadership or stronger power distance or potentially a bit more respect in order for certain things to happen, right? Or certain tasks to get done. And at times, in the 20 years that I've been, working and also developing and coaching mid to senior, frontline, middle to senior level managers, is how do you create that accountability in your team members so that there is that level of not fear. We don't want to manage through fear. It's through coaching, particularly, that you get people to be more self-aware
Mm.
and you get them to create their own accountability for what they do each day, which then breeds engagement, breeds empowerment, breeds confidence to then have them speak up and share their ideas and talk about what they need to. So, would that work in an Asian organisation or an Asian cultured business? Perhaps, but again, how interesting is that to think about? Well, our Gen Zs are coming up. This is how they are generationally, but then culturally, we've still got this strong piece around power distance. How challenged are they going to be, or how not confused, but it's so different for them.
Yeah, no, I think you've hit on something that I feel very passionate about to talk about. So it can be a whole other episode on this one. I think for
Yeah,
me, linking back to the power distance conundrum, right? I feel like because for many organizations, their external operating environment is very volatile right now. A lot of things are shifting at the same time, and then internally, many of these organizations are going through transformation. And right now, what's happening is that the younger workers, those 1990 to younger, are already outnumbering the older workers in many societies. So this issue of how to integrate them will not go away, and I think leaders would do well to actually pay attention to this and in a more deliberate way, in a more open-minded way, which means that maybe in the high power distance cultures, these leaders need to maybe work on a different approach that allows them to empower the younger workers to provide ideas, right? So I think I like the example that you shared, and I think that that's one benefit of having the young workers contribute is that they're full of ideas, they're full of energy, right? And they have the latest knowledge about what is going on, in terms of trends and all that, where the market is going. Maybe they don't have the business experience, but that's where the older workers can be tag team them and help them with it, right? So I think if leaders actually recognize this difference is something that can be harnessed instead of something that needs to be fought on, I think they can actually
yeah,
learn a lot of benefits from it. Yeah, cool.
absolutely.
So Nadia, let's move on to the last topic, which is I call it the geopolitical minefield, but maybe it's not geopolitical per se, but maybe it's just topics in the workplace which are tend to be a bit more sensitive to talk about, right? So how do we navigate around things like that? Maybe for most of us, we don't need to be faced with the situation, but I have a story to share, and I think managing across cultures, leaders have a duty to be mindful about sensitive topics in the cultures that they work with, right? So, my example was many years ago, working in a European organization with as a sales leader for one of the markets, and then of course we come for its national sales meeting, and then we have sales award ceremony, and then we realized that our Japanese team has been nominated for an award, right? So, and then our sales leader, who's European, out of very good intentions, asked all of us to actually, wave little mini Japanese flags, right, just to cheer the Japanese team on and all that, to encourage them, right? Because we're part of the same region that reports to him, and it's kind of we are very competitive in Asia Pacific. We want to be better than the European team or better than the North American team, that sort of thing. Um,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
all done with good intentions, but as we were starting to prepare for this, I was approached by my colleagues in the China team as well as the Korea team, and then they said that they were uncomfortable waving a Japanese flag, in a setting like this. So I think I immediately understood because I lived and worked in China, and there are certain, cultural and political sensitivities amongst these three countries. I think for me, there were two approaches that I could have taken. I chose I guess, the easier one, which is to say, I'm not going to fight the China team on this. I'm just going to excuse them from. I'm going to talk to my boss and excuse them from waving the flag. Right? Maybe they still need to applause and really, and they're happy too, right? They are really very proud of their Japanese colleagues as well. Getting a win for the region. Um, so I chose that approach, and that's the approach that happened. I think the other approach that I could have taken was to maybe push them a little bit to say, hey, that is not our culture here. That is politics, and we don't bring politics to work, right? So I could have
Yeah.
done that as well. I think I didn't want to. I wasn't sure whether they would respond positively to that approach. So I decided it was easier to convince my manager, the sales leader, to say, "Hey, is it okay if the China team is not going to be waving the Japanese flag? They would still stand up and clap enthusiastically for the Japan team." And then he said, "Oh yeah, that'll be fine. It's okay." And then I explained to him what happened, and he understood straight away. So that was no harm done. But it's something that I think a lot of leaders who are not from Asia but who's managing Asia, maybe they're
Yeah.
not so aware that this is, in some situations, this is something important that they need to be sensitive about. Yeah.
And I think that's such a great example just to share in terms of, I think, that geopolitical environment. I mean, and this is why at the beginning I shared that I was raised in a Polish, Greek, and Russian, family. My Polish grandfather, who fought in the Second World War, married my Russian orphaned grandmother, who was also orphaned during the Russian Revolution. And these are two countries who have gone through, I think, political unrest. We look at 100 years later and there's still a
Yeah.
level of unrest in this part of the world. So I was raised, I think, with cultural diversity in my direct family, and so the ability to be open minded, I think, and embrace diversity and foster, I think, inclusivity is something that I just I think it was born and bred in me. But our leaders need to be able to do that. I think we need to lead by example as leaders in particular, and definitely embrace that diversity, foster that inclusivity, and make sure that they're definitely that they're demonstrating that cultural sensitivity. And it sounds like that leader, in the end, once they were prompted and advised, hey, there's a little bit of discomfort here around you expecting them to wave that Japanese flag, then that understanding was there rather than no, that's not on. I want the corporate culture to proceed, or oversee the community culture, and I want them to be waving that flag. So I think it's really important that those sensitivities definitely are understood, and addressed.
Yeah.
I haven't come across it a lot, I must say, James. I think particularly, and I'm because Australia is such a multicultural and diverse community, right? And we have, within the community, there's always a level of unrest, and I think we see that constantly. But like we've chatted about, I think from a corporate culture perspective, or or corporation culture, for me in the 20 years that or 20 plus years, it's superseded, I think, that community culture. And I think in my early career, there was that one example that I shared with you where I was a recruiter on the tools, and I was hiring for one of the big four banks. And there was a unique skill set, right, that was quite unique to two distinct cultures. And at the time, my shortlists were being rejected because of the nationality of the candidate. And what I started to then figure out is that there were two distinct groups within this banking team. And so there had to come a time where we had to sit down with the client, educate the client around this concept of indirect discrimination. And
Mm.
so what we found was they ended up hiring from these two different distinct cultures, but then the team still functioned, but it was quite segregated because they had one team that was, from one particular country, and then another team not far from each other because of the political unrest over years and years and years and years, and the historical challenges that those communities faced. In Australia, they were amicable, but there was still some level of segregation within the direct team within that Big Four bank. So, it's definitely present. It's definitely present, but it's something that I think, again, we've got to continue being quite agile, right? And because we're constantly evolving in terms of our landscape as leaders, I think as colleagues, we've got to constantly stay informed. It's about the adaptability, it's about the openness to change, I guess, particularly when we are working across the different regions and the different cultures. It's so important.
Yeah, no, I think that's a difficult minefield. I would probably say and agree with what you shared, which is that the leader needs to set the ground rules. So if the leader is of the view that in this organization, the corporate culture needs to supersede the various community cultures, then basically you need to have processes in place to minimize or mitigate indirect discrimination in terms of hiring and all that. And as far as possible, where it makes sense, to make sure that colleagues are from different communities are actually integrated into the broader organization in a way that it reflects the rest of Australian society. In your case, that's easier said than done. I know. It's sometimes so easy to form like community cliques in the office because then you can hang out and eat the same food and go and do the same things after work and that kind of thing. And I feel like embracing diversity is not just something that leaders they have been doing it. It's not something that they only they need to do. I think all of us every day when we come into work, we need to also be mindful of when we exhibit behavior where we are just kind of preferring to hang out with a colleague from a certain community or my own community. Then what does it say to the other colleagues who are also, in your case, Australian, but they're not a part of the community? Maybe they feel a little bit left out. Maybe it's okay that once in a while I reach out and ask this other colleague out for lunch, and then just to get to know their culture a little bit more, and just get to know each other a little bit more as individuals, right? So you set aside the culture part for a bit, yeah.
Look, we have things like Harmony Day here in Australia that we celebrate, where it is about celebrating diversity. It's about celebrating, multiculturalism. And particularly, a lot of organisations have morning teas, they have lunches. They tend to, when you feed people and you bring in the food from all the different cultures, that tends to, break down barriers, right? And I think so. There are just some really simple things sometimes that you can do that will again work along the lines of being able to, I think, support or help or minimise and perhaps some of the geopolitical challenges or discomfort that there might be within a team if a leader does sort of sense that it exists. But it's something that we've done. The amount of different morning teas I've had with lots of different food and culture, and have everyone talk about sort of where it originates and why it's their favourite and where it's come from a family line, whether it's the grandma or the auntie or the mum who's shared the recipe. Like, it's beautiful. There's some beautiful stories that tend to also help break down those barriers, which is so important.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's all we might have time for this episode today, Nadia. Thank you so much for sharing all that you have on this episode. And I'm pretty sure I'll get you back again for some of the other topics that we really wanted to talk about as well in terms of workplace minefields, right? So thank you again, Nadia. Do you want to just say something to close?
Honestly, it's been a pleasure. It really has. Obviously, something new for us, but exciting in that. And I look forward to, again, doing more with you if there's an opportunity to do that. We'll keep talking, we'll keep connected. And there's, I think, in addition to what we're talking about now, is that whole compassionate curiosity, which is something that I've recently been introduced to. And that, again, is another podcast in itself. So we can continue on, but I've loved it. Thanks for having me. And I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Nadia. You have a good day.
Thank you. You too. See you, James.